It was a bright afternoon, the kind of day when the sky seemed to clear for anything bad to happen. The black veteran, a man who had spent years serving his country with pride, was finally enjoying some peace after months of hard work. He had just left his mother's house where he'd spent the morning drinking coffee, sharing old memories and feeling the warmth of home. His car was filled with the soft hum of the radio, playing a song that reminded him of better times. For once, life felt simple. He had no idea that in just a few minutes, everything would change. The road ahead was calm and quiet. Children were playing in front yards. People were mowing their lawns, and the world seemed perfectly ordinary. The veteran thought about his service days, how he had carried heavy gear across deserts, how he had stood guard in dangerous zones, and how many times he had nearly lost his life. Serving his country had not been easy, but it had given him a sense of honor. That honor was something he carried everywhere, even now in his quiet civilian life. He believed that being a veteran meant respect. It meant people would see the uniform inside him, even when he wore plain clothes. But the flashing of blue and red lights in his rearview mirror cut through his peaceful thoughts. His heart gave a small jump. He wasn't speeding. He wasn't breaking any laws. In fact, he had just stopped at a light moments ago, carefully watching every signal. Still, the police cruiser behind him blared its siren, demanding that he pull over. He blinked, confused. Why me? He whispered under his breath, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. The veteran signaled and pulled to the side of the road, rolling down his window as he had been taught to do during his military training. Keep calm, stay respectful, cooperate, that was the way to avoid trouble. He watched the two officers step out of their car. Something about their faces, stern and impatient, made him uneasy. They didn't look like they had stopped him for a broken taillight or a simple traffic issue. As one officer approached, the veteran gave a polite nod. "Good afternoon, officer. Is there a problem?" His voice was calm, respectful, the same tone he had once used to address commanding officers. But the officer didn't answer his question. Instead, he leaned down, eyes scanning the veteran like he was already guilty of something. "Step out of the car," the officer ordered, his tone sharp. The veteran frowned in confusion. "Sir, may I ask why?" "Step out of the car," the officer repeated, louder this time. The second officer stood back, hand resting near his holster as if waiting for trouble. The veteran's chest tightened. He had faced real danger overseas, but this felt different. This wasn't a battlefield. Yet he suddenly felt the same rush of adrenaline he had felt in combat. Except now, the enemy wasn't wearing a uniform. The enemy was supposed to be someone who protected the law. Slowly, he stepped out of the car, his hands raised slightly to show he wasn't resisting. "I'm a veteran," he said quickly, hoping his words would carry some weight. "Oh, here's my ID." He reached carefully for his wallet, pulling out his military identification card, something he always carried with pride. The officer glanced at it, smirked, and shoved it back into his hand. "That doesn't mean anything here," he muttered. The words hit the veteran harder than any insult. Didn't mean anything? He had fought for this country, nearly died for it. And now his service was being brushed aside like it was worthless. The neighborhood around them grew quiet. A few people peeked through their curtains, watching the scene unfold. To them, it probably looked like just another traffic stop. But to the veteran, it felt like his entire dignity was being stripped away in public view. The first officer began, asking questions, none of which made sense. Where was he going? Why was he in this part of town? Did he have anything illegal in his car? Each question dripped with suspicion, as though they had already decided he was guilty. The veteran answered calmly, but his voice carried a growing edge of frustration. He had nothing to hide, yet they treated him like a criminal. The radio and the patrol car crackled. The second officer glanced at it, then at the veteran, his eyes narrowing. "Turn around," he said. "Hands behind your back." The veteran froze. "Excuse me, what's the charge?" "Don't make this harder than it has to be," the first officer barked. Time seemed to slow. Cars drove past, some slowing down, to watch. The veteran could feel the humiliation pressing down on him like a heavy weight. He wasn't just being stopped. He was being judged, condemned, and treated like he didn't matter. He thought of his fellow soldiers, men and women who would never come home, who had given their lives. He thought of the medals he had earned, the long nights in foreign lands, the promises he had made to protect freedom. And now, here he was, on a quiet street in his own country. Treated like a threat, as the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, the veteran's heart sank. This wasn't just a mistake, was a betrayal. He had once believed that wearing the title of veteran meant protection, honor, and respect. But in that moment, under the hot afternoon sun, with strangers staring and police officers gripping his arms, he realized something painful. The uniform he had worn, the sacrifices he had made, meant nothing to the men who now forced him toward their squad car. And as the door slammed shut behind him, the ordinary day that had started with coffee and family was gone forever. A new story had begun, one filled with injustice, humiliation, and a fight for dignity that was far from over. The veteran sat in the back of the squad car, his wrists burning from the metal cuffs that had been tightened far too much. Every time the car bounced over a crack in the road, the steel cut deeper into his skin. He tried to keep his breathing steady, but his chest rose and fell with growing anger and disbelief. He had spent years being trained to stay calm under fire, to keep his composure even when bullets tore the air around him. Yet somehow, sitting in the back of that police car, he felt more powerless than he ever had on the battlefield. When they pulled into the precinct, the humiliation deepened. The two officers walked him inside, holding his arms as if he were a dangerous criminal. Other officers at desks turned their heads to look. Some smirked. Others whispered. The veteran felt the weight of every stare. Once, people had looked at him with admiration when they saw his uniform. Now, people looked at him like he was less than human. The booking officer asked his name and details, typing with lazy fingers as if this was just another routine case. The veteran tried again to explain. "I'm a U.S. Army veteran. T.S. Served. Overseas, this is a mistake." But the man behind the desk didn't even glance up. He simply waved a hand and said, "Yeah, everyone's got a story." His voice was laced with sarcasm. The veteran felt his throat tighten. He had been taught. That respect was earned. He had given his blood, sweat, and years of his life to earn it. But here, respect was replaced with mockery. His words were nothing but noise to them, as the officers removed his belt and personal belongings, tossing them carelessly into a plastic bag. The veteran's pride was stripped away piece by piece. His military ID, which he always carried with him like a badge of honor, was shoved aside without even a glance. To them, it was just another piece of plastic. To him, it was proof of sacrifice, proof of a life lived for something greater. The holding cell door opened with a loud clang. The officer shoved him inside and muttered, "Sit tight, soldier boy." The nickname wasn't meant to honor him. It was meant to sting, to remind him that his service meant nothing in their eyes. Inside the cell, the veteran sat on the cold metal bench. The walls smelled of disinfectant and stale sweat. A flickering light above buzzed faintly, making the room feel even more suffocating. He ran a hand through his hair and closed his eyes, trying to process the nightmare he had fallen into. He remembered the day he enlisted. He remembered the pride in his father's eyes, the tears in his mother's, and the firm handshake of the officer who had welcomed him into the ranks. He remembered the camaraderie of his fellow soldiers, men and women who became his family on the battlefield. Together, they had survived storms, explosions, and long nights filled with fear. He had faced death with command, somehow lived, and yet, none of that mattered now. None of those sacrifices shielded him from being treated like a criminal in his own country. Hours dragged on. He asked for a phone call, but was ignored. He asked to speak to a supervisor, but his request was laughed off. The veteran felt the walls closing in, not just the walls of the cell, but the invisible walls of injustice that seemed unbreakable. When the officers passed by his cell, they joked with each other loudly, making comments they knew he could hear. "Some hero, huh?" one said. "Probably made the whole thing up." The words cut deep. He had medals locked away at home, medals that had been pinned to his chest by generals. He had scars across his body that told stories of nights when survival was not guaranteed. He had letters from families of fellow soldiers thanking him for saving lives. And yet, here, he was reduced to nothing more than a punchline. The veteran sat silently, clenching his fists until his knuckles turned white. He thought of his brothers in arms, who never made it back. He thought of the funerals he had attended, the flag-draped coffins, the sound of taps echoing across cemeteries. Those men and women had given everything. And if they were alive, he wondered, would they also be sitting here, humiliated in the very country they died to protect? As the hours turned into night, the veteran's anger grew into something else, a heavy sadness. He wasn't just humiliated. He was betrayed. Betrayed by a system that promised freedom, but gave him chains. Betrayed by officers who were supposed to serve and protect, but instead used power to degrade. Still, even in the darkness of that cell, a fire burned inside him. He wasn't just going to accept this. He had faced enemies stronger and crueler than this before, and he had survived. Something inside him whispered that this was not the end. That somehow the truth would come to light. The humiliation was unbearable, yes, but it planted something inside him, a quiet determination. The officers may have laughed. The booking clerk may have ignored him. The precinct may have seen him as nothing more than a number in their system. But the veteran knew the truth. His story was not over. And when the right people found out what had been done, justice would come crashing through those walls. The night dragged on with silence and the faint hum of the flickering light. The veteran sat upright on the bench, staring at the bars. His mind replayed the moment he was pulled over, the cold eyes of the officer, the sting of the handcuffs. Every detail burned itself into his memory. They had stripped him of dignity, but they hadn't taken his will. Somewhere, somehow, someone would hear a B*. The sound of the heavy cell door echoed long after it slammed shut, ringing in the veteran's ears like a cruel reminder that he no longer had control over his own life. He sat on the cold bench, wrists sore from the cuffs that had only just been removed. For the first time since leaving the battlefield, he felt completely powerless. Out there, in war zones far away, he had at least known who the enemy was. Here, in his own country, the enemy wore badges and uniforms meant to protect him. The minutes dragged like hours. He asked once more for a phone call, his voice steady but firm this time. "I have the right to contact someone, please." The officer standing guard outside his cell barely turned his head. "Sit down, you'll get your turn." But the turn never came. Instead, the veteran was treated as though his voice didn't matter at all. Each time he spoke, the officers responded with silence, smirks, or snide remarks. He could feel the weight of humiliation pressing down on him, heavier with each passing second. Finally, the door swung open and two officers stepped inside. "On your feet," one of them barked. The veteran rose slowly, holding himself with as much dignity as he could muster. They grabbed his arms and led him down a hallway lined with buzzing fluorescent lights that flickered like broken stars. The air smelled of bleach, metal, and something sour like despair itself had seeped into the walls. They brought him into a small, windowless room. A single table sat in the center with 2 chairs on either side. A camera hung from the ceiling, its red light blinking like a silent witness. The officers shoved him into the chair. One of them leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "All right, let's get this straight. What were you doing driving through that neighborhood?" The veteran stared back, confused. "Driving home from my mother's house. That's all." The officer leaned back, scoffing. "You expect us to believe that? You don't belong there." Those words stung more than the handcuffs had. You don't belong. He had spent years overseas, serving in places where he barely spoke the language, protecting people he didn't even know. And here, in his own country, he was being told he didn't belong in a neighborhood he had every right to drive through. He tried to explain again, carefully, calmly. "I served in the Army. I can give you names of my commanding officers. I can show you proof of my service. This is a mistake." But the officers laughed. "A mistake," one said. "The mistake is you thinking that matters here." They began, asking questions that made no sense. Did he know anyone dealing drugs in the area? Was he transporting weapons? Did he have gang connections? Each question was more ridiculous than the last. The veteran shook his head each time, his frustration growing. No, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm a soldier, not a criminal." But the more he spoke, the less they listened. Their minds were already made up. To them, he wasn't a veteran. He wasn't a man who had sacrificed years of his life for the flag that flew above their very building. To them, he was just another suspect, another target, another body to throw into the system. The veteran clenched his fists under the table. He remembered standing at attention during roll calls, remembered saluting the flag with pride, remembered fighting to defend the freedoms these very officers were trampling on now. His chest burned with anger, but he swallowed it down. He knew. Anger would only make things worse. Hours turned into the beginning of the night. He was fingerprinted, photographed, treated like he had already been convicted. They took his belongings, logged them, and handed him nothing but a slip of paper that meant little in that moment. His military eye dyed the card that once gave him. Access to bases, barracks, and battlefields was tossed into the evidence bag like garbage. Back in his cell, the veteran sat in silence. The humiliation was no longer just about him. It was about every soldier who had ever worn the uniform. Every veteran who had come home hoping to find respect, and every black man who had ever been judged before being heard. His story was not unique, but it was happening to him now, and it burned like fire in his veins. As the hours stretched on, he began to replay every second of the arrest. The flashing lights, the stern faces, the dismissal of his ID, the cold words, "That doesn't mean anything here." He knew then that this wasn't about justice. It was about power being used to crush, to silence, to humiliate. Still, even as despair crept in, a flicker of hope remained. He thought of his old comrades, men who had connections in places higher than these officers could ever imagine. He thought of the Pentagon, of the people who had once trusted him with missions that shaped wars. If word ever reached them, if they ever discovered what had been done, the walls of this precinct would tremble. But for now, all he could do was endure. And endurance was something he knew well. He had endured deserts, storms, ambushes, and endless nights under fire. He would endure this too. The night passed slowly. The veteran sat upright, refusing to let his body slump in defeat. Every sound echoed: the jingling of keys, the laughter of officers in the hallway, the buzz of the broken light above. He memorized it all, carving every detail into his mind. If he ever got the chance, he would tell this story, and no one would be able to deny it. And though the walls seemed unbreakable, deep down he sensed something. Justice might be delayed, but it was coming. when it came. It would not just free him, it would bring the entire precinct to its knees. Asterisk, the metal bars clanged shut behind him, echoing through the empty hallway as the veteran was once again pushed into his cell. But this time he noticed things he hadn't before. The walls were painted a dull gray, but beneath the peeling paint he could see scratches, names carved, numbers etched, silent records of people who had once sat in the same space. It felt like every mark on the wall told a story of injustice. And now he was one of them. The hours inside the precinct moved differently. Time didn't flow, it crawled. The buzzing fluorescent lights flickered above, creating shadows that seemed to mock him. Somewhere down the hall, he could hear the faint sound of laughter, officers joking, maybe sharing coffee, living their normal lives while he sat in silence, treated as if he were less than human. The veteran's stomach growled. He hadn't eaten since breakfast with his mother earlier that day. When he asked for food, an officer tossed him a stale sandwich still wrapped in crumpled plastic. It landed on the floor of his cell with a thud. Bon. A.P. Petty, soldier boy, the officer sneered before walking away. Asterisk, the veteran picked it up slowly, staring at the crushed bread. He had eaten worse in war zones, but it wasn't the food that cut into him, it was the way it was given. With contempt, with no respect. As if he were an animal, he sat back down on the hard bench, his mind running in circles. He thought about the contrast between this room and the barracks he once lived in. The barracks were rough, yes, but they carried pride. There, even in hardship, there was unity. Here, in this station, there was only isolation and humiliation. At one point, a young officer walked past his cell. The veteran called out, "Please, I just want one phone call. That's all I ask." The young officer paused, looking torn for a brief second, but then, glancing over his shoulder at his colleagues, he shook his head quickly and moved on. Fear, the veteran recognized it instantly. The young man wasn't heartless. He was scared. Scared of defying the system around him. Scared of breaking the unspoken rule, don't treat this man like a human. The veteran leaned back, exhaling sharply. He remembered similar moments overseas. He had seen locals who wanted to help American soldiers, but were too afraid of the militant groups controlling their villages. Fear was powerful. Fear could silence even the strongest voice. As night fell deeper, the precinct grew quieter. The veteran could hear the occasional clatter of typewriters and the ringing of phones in the distance. But inside his cell, there was only stillness. He pressed his palms against the cold bars and whispered to himself, "You've been through worse. You can survive this too." But survival wasn't the same as dignity. Survival meant breathing. Dignity meant living with respect. Tandat was what they were taking from him. Later, 2 officers came back to his cell. One of them carried a clipboard. "Stand up," he ordered. The veteran obeyed. They asked him the same questions again, over and over, as if trying to trip him up. Where had he been before the stop? Where was he going? Why was he driving that route? His answers never changed, but the officers wrote notes, exchanged glances, and smirked like they were building a case out of thin air. When he tried to protest, one officer leaned close to the bars and whispered so only he could hear, "No one's going to believe you. You're just another guy we pulled in. Whatever story you think you have, it ends here." The words chilled him. Not because they were true, but because they revealed what the officers really believed, that they had all the power and he had none. The veteran sat back down once they left, his heart pounding. For a moment, he felt the weight of hopelessness pressing down like a stone on his chest. But then he remembered the people he had served with. He remembered standing shoulder to shoulder with soldiers who refused to give up, even when the odds were against them. He remembered their faces, their courage, their sacrifice. And he reminded himself, this was not the end of his story. Hours later, he overheard two officers talking near the hallway. Their voices were low, but he caught pieces of the conversation. Said he's a veteran. Yeah, they all say that. Doesn't mean anything. What if he's telling the truth? Though, doesn't matter. Nobody outside will hear. About it, those words stuck in his mind. Nobody outside will hear about it. They thought they could bury him in silence, erase his story behind concrete walls. But the veteran knew something they didn't. Silence was never permanent. Every injustice left a trail. Every wrongful act had a way of reaching the light as the night turned into the early hours of morning. The veteran remained awake, staring at the ceiling. His back ached from the hard bench, his body tired, but his mind sharp. He was replaying every word, every detail, every sneer and insult. He was memorizing everything, because someday, somehow, it would tell the world exactly what happened inside these walls. For now, he endured, alone, humiliated, stripped of dignity. But deep inside, the fire still burned a fire that no walls, no bars, and no corrupt officers could extinguish. And he knew one thing with absolute certainty: the moment the right people discovered what had been done to him, this entire precinct would pay the price. The night dragged on endlessly, the hours bleeding together under the dim, flickering light above the veteran's cell. He had lost track of time, but his body told him it had been far too long since he'd tasted freedom. His back ached, his wrists still bore red marks from the cuffs, and his throat was dry from repeating the same words no one seemed to hear. This is a mistake. I'm a veteran. I served my country. He knew they weren't listening. The precinct walls seemed designed to silence him, to make him vanish like countless others who had been swallowed by the system. But what the officers didn't know was that outside those walls, there were people who cared. People who would not stay silent. Back at his mother's house, the hours had also stretched long. She sat by the window, staring at the road where her son should have returned hours ago. She knew him. He was never careless, never reckless. Something was wrong. With trembling hands, she dialed his phone again. It went straight to voicemail. Her heart pounded with fear. She remembered the look on his face that morning, calm and happy, sipping coffee before he left. He had survived war. She had prayed for him every day when he was overseas, and he had come home alive. Could it be that here, in the very country he had fought for, he was in danger? Finally, she picked up the house phone and began making calls. First to local hospitals, then to friends, then to people she knew from the veterans' old unit. Her son had told her stories of his comrades, men and women who never left each other behind. She prayed they would answer. Hours later, one did. A former squad mate, now working in a military office, picked up the call. He listened as the veteran's mother explained what had happened, how her son had been stopped, how he hadn't returned, how no one would tell her where he was. The soldier on the other end felt his blood run cold. "He's one of ours," the man said firmly. "I'll make sure the right people know." That was the moment everything began to shift. The word spread quickly through old networks, from soldier to soldier, from desk to desk. Some were low-ranking, but others had climbed high since leaving the field. And one of the man officers stationed at the Pentagon recognized the name immediately. This wasn't just any veteran. This was a decorated soldier, someone who had carried out missions that never made the news but had been vital to national security. Someone who had risked his life more than once for orders that came directly from Washington. When the Pentagon officer heard what had happened, his jaw tightened. Wrongfully detained, disrespected, treated like a criminal. This wasn't just injustices, was an insult to the institution itself. He made a call, then another, and soon the case was no longer buried inside a small-town precinct. It was on the radar of some of the most powerful people in the country, back inside the station. The veteran remained unaware of the storm that was beginning to form outside. To him, it still felt like nothing had changed. The officers still mocked him when they walked by. His requests were still ignored. The cell still felt like a coffin waiting to close, but the cracks were forming. The silence was breaking. The phone lines at the precinct began to ring late into the night. At first, the desk sergeant brushed it off as routine. But then, one call after another came in, each one from higher up, each one more forceful. The sergeant's brow furrowed as he scribbled notes, his tone shifting from smug to nervous. "Who did you say you were with again?" he asked into the receiver. "The Pentagon?" His face paled. Within an hour, the entire precinct felt the tension. Officers whispered to each other in the hallways, their earlier laughter gone. Something was happening, something bigger than them. In his cell, the veteran noticed the change in atmosphere. The guards walked with quicker steps, spoke in lower voices. The same officers who had mocked him now avoided making eye contact. He didn't know why, but he sensed it. The tide was turning. Then, as the early morning hours crept closer, the sound of footsteps echoed louder than before. This time, they weren't just regular officers. The door to the hallway opened, and men in suits stepped inside, federal investigators sent directly under Pentagon orders. Their presence was heavy, commanding, undeniable. The veteran lifted his head as the cell door swung open. For the first time since this nightmare began, someone looked at him not with mockery or suspicion, but with recognition. "Sir," one of the men said firmly, his voice carrying both authority and respect. "We're here for you." The veteran blinked in disbelief. He rose slowly, his body stiff, his pride bruised, but his spirit unbroken. He stepped out of the cell, the hallway now lined with officers who suddenly looked small, powerless, and exposed. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The silence spoke for him. The very people who had dismissed his service, who had stripped him of dignity, were now watching as he was escorted out, not as a criminal, but as a soldier. And though he didn't know all the details yet, one truth became clear in that moment. The call had reached higher powers. And those powers had answered. The morning sun had just begun to rise outside, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and gold. But inside the precinct, the atmosphere was nothing like the calmness of the dawn. Phones were still ringing, messages kept pouring in, and officers who had spent the night mocking the veteran now shifted nervously at their desks. Something bigger than them was moving. And it was moving fast. When the federal car pulled up outside the precinct, the building seemed to freeze. Out stepped men and women in dark suits, their badges glinting in the early light. They didn't move with hesitation or confusion. They walked with certainty, with authority, like they already owned the ground they stepped on. And in a way, they did. Inside the cell block, the veteran was sitting quietly, his back straight, his eyes steady. He had learned to read the air, and he could sense it now, the shift, the unease, the way even the guards avoided looking at him. He didn't know exactly what was happening, but his instincts told him justice was finally on the way. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Heavy, commanding footsteps. The cell door opened, and a man in a suit stepped in. He wasn't just another officer. His presence carried weight. He looked the veteran in the eyes and said with a firm voice, "Sir, you're coming with us." The veteran stood, his heart pounding but his face calm. As they walked him out of the cell, he saw the sudden silence of the precinct. Officers, who had jeered at him earlier, now sat stiffly at their desks, their faces pale. The balance of power had shifted completely in the interrogation room. The precinct captain was already sweating. A group of Pentagon officials sat across from him, papers spread across the table. Phones buzzing with direct calls from Washington. "You detained a decorated veteran without cause," one of them said sharply. "You denied him his rights, ignored protocol, and mocked his service. Do you realize the seriousness of this?" The captain stammered, trying to find excuses. We believed he was suspicious. We were only following." Following what? The official cut him off. Following prejudice. Following abuse of authority. "This man put his life on the line for this country, and you treated him like a criminal." The room fell silent. The captain's excuses melted away under the weight of authority he could not challenge. Meanwhile, in another office, investigators began pulling files, seizing records, and questioning every officer. Who had touched the case? The Pentagon had come down hard. And they weren't leaving until answers were found. The veteran was led out into the main lobby where he was finally uncuffed. His wrists were sore, his dignity bruised. But as the metal fell away, he felt something. Inside him returned something the precinct had tried to take. His honor. One of the officials turned to him. "You've been wronged, sir. And this precinct will answer for it." The veteran nodded, saying little. He didn't need to speak. The sight of Pentagon officials storming through the station, the panic in the eyes of the officers, the sudden collapse of arrogance, that was enough. Outside, word began to spread. Cameras arrived, reporters rushed to the scene, and whispers filled the crowd. A veteran wrongfully detained, the Pentagon stepping in. The entire precinct under investigation. It was no longer a hidden story behind concrete walls. It was front page news, and the whole country would soon know. Back inside, the officers who had mocked him earlier were being lined up, their names written down, their actions reviewed. Some tried to deny their words, others lowered their heads, knowing there was no escaping the truth. The jokes, the insults, the sneers, they had all been noted. And now every detail was being used against them. For the veteran, it was a surreal moment. Less than 24 hours ago, he had been treated like he was nothing. Now the very people who had laughed at his ID were scrambling to explain themselves to the Pentagon. The walls that had once trapped him were now closing in on those who had abused him. The final blow came when the lead official stood in the middle of the precinct, his voice carrying across the entire room. "Effective immediately, this precinct is shut down. Every officer here is suspended until further notice. You will cooperate fully with the investigation, or you will face federal charges." The room fell silent. Officers froze, staring in disbelief. The building that had once been their fortress of power was now stripped of it in a single order. The veteran stood by the door, watching. He didn't gloat, he didn't smile, simply stood tall, his posture carrying the same discipline he had once carried on the battlefield. For him, this wasn't about revenge, it was about justice. As he stepped outside into the bright morning air, the sunlight hit his face. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, and strangers reached out to shake his hand. He didn't answer yet. He just breathed in deeply, savoring the freedom, the dignity, the truth that had finally been restored. Behind him, the precinct was no longer the place of humiliation it had been hours before. Now it was the site of its own downfall, a symbol of what happens when corruption and arrogance meet the weight of truth and accountability. And for the veteran, this was more than just his personal victory. It was proof that even when injustice rises high, justice has a way of rising higher. The news spread faster than wildfire. By midday, the story was no longer confined to the walls of the small precinct. Television networks broke into their regular programming with urgent headlines. Pentagon officials shut down local precinct after wrongful detention of black veteran. The story lit up social media feeds. Hashtags began trending, and thousands of people across the nation demanded answers. But inside the precinct, The atmosphere was nothing short of chaos. Officers who had strutted around with arrogance the day before now sat with pale faces, their confidence stripped away. The once bustling station was filled with the sounds of drawers slamming, papers being collected, and investigators issuing sharp orders. "Hand over your badge," one investigator demanded, holding out his hand to a sergeant who had laughed at the veteran the night before. The sergeant's face tightened, but he had no choice. He unclipped his badge and gun, placing them into the investigator's palm. For the first time in years, he wasn't in control, he was powerless. One by one, officers were called into makeshift interrogation rooms. They were asked direct, unforgiving questions. Why did you stop him? Why was his ID dismissed? Who ordered his detention? Every excuse crumbled under the weight of evidence. The veteran's fingerprints, his military ID, his record of service, all of it proved beyond doubt that the precinct had acted with cruelty, negligence, and prejudice. The captain of the precinct sat in his office, sweating as he tried to explain himself to Pentagon officials. "We thought he was suspicious," he stammered. "We had to do our duty." "Your duty," one official snapped, slamming a folder on the desk. Inside were the veteran's service records, medals, and commendations. "Your duty was to serve and protect. Instead, you humiliated a man who once risked his life to protect you. This is more than misconduct. This is a disgrace." The captain had no answer. His lips trembled, his eyes darting to the walls as though searching for an escape that did not exist. Meanwhile, the veteran stood outside the building, surrounded by reporters. Microphones and cameras were thrust toward him, questions flying like bullets. "Sir, how do you feel about what happened? What message do you have for the country? Do you plan to take legal action?" He didn't speak immediately. His silence was powerful, louder than any words. When he finally did speak, his voice was calm but steady, carrying the weight of every humiliation he had endured. "This isn't just about me. It's about every veteran, every person of color, every citizen who's ever been mistreated by those sworn to protect them. Justice doesn't stop with it needs to reach everyone." His words struck deep. Across the country, people watching on TV felt chills. His dignity, even after all he had endured, made his story even more powerful back inside. The Pentagon officials made their move. A formal statement was issued. "The precinct is hereby suspended in full, effective immediately. Every officer will undergo federal review. The chain of command is broken until accountability is restored." For the officers, it was devastating. Their careers, once protected by silence and arrogance, were now dangling by a thread. Some wept quietly. Others clenched their jaws in anger, muttering under their breath. But it didn't matter anymore. Their power was gone. The veteran watched. As officers left the building one by one, their heads lowered, their badges surrendered. It was a reversal he never imagined witnessing. Less than a day ago, these same people had mocked him, dismissed him, treated him like a criminal. Now, they were the ones facing judgment. Protesters began to gather outside, holding signs that read, "Justice for veterans, accountability now. And no one is above the law." Their voices rose together, chanting, demanding change. The sound filled the air, echoing louder than the sirens that had first stopped him on the road. The veteran felt something stirred deep within him, not revenge, but vindication. This wasn't about tearing people down. It was about showing the truth, about forcing the system to face itself. And for once, the system could not look away. Federal trucks rolled in to seize evidence from the precinct. Computers were loaded into vans. Boxes of files were carried out. Every detail of the station's operations would be dissected, every case reviewed, every abuse uncovered. The precinct wasn't just being punished for him, it was being dismantled piece by piece. Exposed to the world late in the evening when the chaos began to quiet, a Pentagon official approached the veteran. "Sir," he said respectfully, "this is only the beginning. There will be hearings, there will be trials, and justice will continue to move forward." The veteran nodded. His eyes, though tired, shone with a quiet strength. He had been wronged, but now he saw something larger taking shape. His pain had sparked a chain reaction that was shaking an entire system. That night, as he finally returned to his mother's house, she embraced him tightly, tears streaming down her face. "I knew you'd come back," she whispered. "I prayed for this." And as he held her, he realized that this moment was bigger than both of them. His humiliation had become a nation's wake-up call. His suffering had exposed a wound that could no longer be ignored. The precinct was no longer just a building. It had become a symbol of arrogance, of corruption, and of what happens when justice finally strikes. And this was only the beginning. The veteran sat at his kitchen table the next morning, his hands wrapped around a warm cup of coffee. It should have been an ordinary morning, but nothing felt ordinary anymore. The quiet hum of the refrigerator, the soft light of dawn slipping through the curtains, it all seemed unreal compared to the chaos of the last 24 hours. He had gone from being treated like a criminal to standing in the middle of a storm that shook the entire country. His mother placed a plate of food in front of him. He barely touched it. His thoughts were still trapped inside the precinct. Walls replaying every sneer, every insult, every moment of humiliation. Yet now, when he looked at those memories, they no longer carried the same weight of despair. They carried a new meaning. Proof of injustice. Proof of what needed to change. The phone rang constantly. Calls came from reporters, veterans, organizations, civil rights groups, and even members of Congress. Everyone wanted to hear his story. Everyone wanted him to speak. But the veteran sat quietly, unsure at first. He had never wanted fame. He had only wanted respect, something so simple, yet denied to him in the most brutal way. By midday, a press conference was arranged. Cameras lined the steps outside the courthouse. Protesters gathered, their chants echoing across the city. Justice for veterans. No more silence. Equality for all. The air buzzed with energy, anger, and hope. When the veteran stepped up to the microphone, the crowd went silent. Reporters raised their cameras, pens poised. For a moment, he simply looked at the sea of faces, strangers, united by a single cause. He cleared his throat, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I never thought I would be here," he began. "I wore the uniform of this country with pride. I stood in deserts and jungles. I fought in battles far from home, and I carried the weight of knowing I might never come back. I did it willingly because I believed in what this country stood for: justice, freedom, and respect." The crowd listened, their eyes locked on him. "But yesterday," he continued, "I was not treated with justice. I was not given freedom. I was not shown respect. I was handcuffed, mocked, humiliated, not because of what I had done, but because of who I am. A black man, a veteran, a human being who deserved better." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Some nodded, others shouted, "That's right. This is not just my story," he said, his voice rising. "This is the story of countless others who never had the chance to speak. People who were silenced, ignored, and left behind by the very system that promised to protect them. But today, their voices are with me. Today, we stand together." Applause erupted, thunderous and unstoppable. "This is not the end," he finished. "This is the beginning. We must demand accountability. We must demand change. Because if one precinct can be shut down for injustice, then others can too." If one voice can be heard, then millions more can rise. The crowd roared, chanting his name, chanting for justice, chanting for a better tomorrow. In the weeks that followed, his story became a rallying cry across the nation. News outlets replayed his speech, his calm dignity in the face of cruelty. Social media erupted with support. Veterans groups organized marches, and civil rights leaders joined hands with military families to demand reform. Lawsuits were filed. Investigations widened. Other precincts with histories of abuse suddenly found themselves under scrutiny. The veteran's story had lit a fire that could not be extinguished. Invitations poured in from universities, organizations, even military academies. He was asked to speak about justice, about service, about what it meant to truly protect and serve. Each time he spoke, he reminded people that respect was not a privilege, it was a right, and through it all, he remained humble. He never asked for fame, never sought revenge. He carried himself with the same quiet strength he had always carried on the battlefield. To him, this was not about being a hero. It was about being a man who refused to stay silent. Late one evening, as he stood on his porch watching the sunset, his mother stepped outside and touched his shoulder. "You've started something, son," she said softly. "Something bigger than yourself." He nodded, eyes fixed on the horizon. "Maybe that's what I was meant to do all along," he replied. And as the last rays of sunlight faded, he felt a deep sense of peace. Not because the fight was over, it was only just beginning, but because his voice had finally been heard. His pain had turned into power. His story had become a beacon. From that day forward, his name was no longer just his own. It echoed across the country, carried in chants, written on banners, and spoken in homes. It became a symbol of resilience, justice, and truth. The veteran who had once been silenced inside a cell was now a voice that could not be ignored, and that voice, steady and unyielding, would continue to echo across cities, across states, across the nation until justice was not just a promise, but a reality.